Tonight, a damning report into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
This is colonization. This is discrimination. This is genocide.
The findings, the calls for justice, and the families still searching for answers. So, will governments take action? I'll ask one of the ministers responsible.
Donald Trump gets the royal treatment inside Buckingham Palace. But outside, here on the streets of London, a very different story.
It came out of nowhere, so it didn't work. The system's not working.
As a dangerous tornado tore through an Ottawa suburb, a warning went out. So why didn't everyone get the message? This is The National.
This is the Museum of History, where today history was made. Just across the river from Parliament Hill on traditional Algonquin territory, the final report of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was presented to the Government of Canada. That's why The National begins here tonight. The commission that has produced that report has enormous goals for this country, sweeping calls for change detailed in more than 200 recommendations. At Time today, the promise of change filled the halls with hopeful applause, but hope was always colored by violence and intolerance, the sins of the past, and yes, the present.
I want to start as I was taught by an elder in Saskatchewan, to acknowledge the spirits of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and to welcome them.
It took nearly 3 years to get here and more than 2,000 testimonials leading to this strong condemnation.
The significant, persistent, and deliberate pattern of systemic racial and gendered human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses is the cause of the disappearances, murders, and violence, and this is genocide.
There were calls to all the people of Canada.
First, read our report. Speak out against racism, sexism, and misogyny.
More pointedly, there were those 231 calls for justice to governments and institutions delivered today by families of the murdered and missing.
All governments must further ensure that the rights of Indigenous children to retain and be educated in their Indigenous language are upheld,
to improve the representation of Indigenous peoples in media and pop culture,
to end racism and sexualized stereotypes of Indigenous women and girls.
We call upon all governments to ensure that protection orders are available to protect the safety of Indigenous women and girls.
Then came the ceremony's symbolic passing of the report, wrapped in a red blanket, the color that has been used to bring attention to the issue, officially handed to the Prime Minister.
I refuse to let our present and our future mirror our past. To the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls of Canada, to their families and to survivors, we have failed you. We will fail you no longer.
You heard the Chief Commissioner use the word genocide to describe Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples. Now, Salima Shivji takes a deeper look at what it really means and the debate over whether it's deserved.
A loaded word mentioned again and again. The report argues the deaths and disappearances of Indigenous women is genocide, a direct result of state policy, whether it be residential schools, forced sterilization, or the 60s coup of Indigenous children from their families.
To the people that don't think that there is a genocide today, we have 1,200 pages.
The Prime Minister accepted those pages with a promise to act, but without repeating that word even when confronted with it.
This is an uncomfortable day for Canada, but it is an essential day.
I was hoping that he would have, that courage to put that new chapter that we are all requesting.
But in a clear indication of how contentious a word genocide is, even commissioners disagree.
We don't need to hear the word genocide come out of the Prime Minister's mouth, because the families have told us, the survivors have told us their truths.
I fear.
Romeo Dallaire saw a genocide unfold in Rwanda. The legal definition, he says, requires intent to destroy.
Is that an act of genocide? Is it? I got a problem. I got a problem. Is it deliberate? Do we want that to happen? Is that what our government wants to happen? Or is our government just that inept?
A divisive debate that could overshadow the report's recommendations.
Perhaps they had to use a term like genocide in order to sound the alarm, and people will take notice, and finally action will result. But I think we have to guard against using that term in too many ways, because then it'll cease to have the singular importance and horror that it warrants.
The current Attorney General made it clear this is not the day to argue semantics.
The important thing today is not about definitions, but about action, and that's where we're going.
So Salima's here with me now. As you showed us there, Salima, the Prime Minister, other ministers, a little reluctant to use that word today. Why was that?
Yeah, that's right, but not avoiding it per se. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, actually said the word genocide at an event tonight in a matter-of-fact way when talking about the report.
Earlier this morning, the National Inquiry formally presented their final report, in which they found that the tragic violence that Indigenous women and girls have experienced amounts to genocide.
Notice he did not say the government came to that conclusion. So the Liberals are walking a fine line as they try to fulfill one of their key promises, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And what the legal consequences would be of calling this officially genocide is an open question and remains an open question. But there could be certainly a diplomatic effect, of course, when that is used. A government source actually did say that they expect other countries to bring up the report calling this genocide and used on the international stage by countries that could not really appreciate being called out for their own human rights failures.
Sure. Okay, so the debate continues on that issue. Thanks, Salima. Salima Shipji here with me. Today's ceremony was an emotional one, but for some families, the inquiry's final report was disappointing. Not because of what it said, but because of what it did not. Dozens of cases remain unresolved, and if those families were hoping to hear of new investigations, they were disappointed. Olivia Stefanovic spent the morning with two of them.
Outside the National Inquiry's closing ceremony, a father still waiting to be heard.
Really what it comes down to for my daughter.
Cheyenne Fox was 20 years old when she plunged 24 stories to her death. Toronto police ruled out criminal activity. Her father never accepted that.
I wanted them to reopen that case and put the way it is. She was murdered.
After years of fighting, he finally got his daughter's death reclassified as undetermined, something he wishes he didn't have to do in the first place.
That's where the root problem is. The policing, like I said, our case is 5 years old, and I don't know what else to do.
The National Inquiry was never meant to solve cases, but in their final report, the commissioners make recommendations to improve relations between investigators and families.
I've really lost trust in the system.
Barbara Sevigny's sister, Marianne Birmingham, was killed more than 30 years ago in Iqaluit. She says RCMP only recently started to update her family.
I was not expecting an update call, just to say that we're still working on your sister's case. She hasn't been forgotten.
Such tragedy. We often, what would she be if she were alive?
Despite having appeared before the inquiry, the family is here, still seeking answers for their mom.
I want her to have a closure. She's been waiting 33 years and she'd love to have a closure.
They say closure will come from change in the way police are resourced and handle investigations, so loved ones like theirs are never forgotten. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Gatineau, Quebec.
In a statement today, the RCMP said it's already made many of the changes recommended by the inquiry. They include improving communication with families in investigations of missing persons, reviewing 30,000 sexual assault cases, strengthening cultural awareness training for all employees, and engagement with Indigenous leaders and elders. The federal government is also promising action tonight, but as you heard earlier, officially recognizing genocide was not as clearly stated as part of that promise. I did ask the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations about that earlier today. Do you agree with their characterization of what happened here as genocide?
I do agree that the commissioners needed to write what they needed to write based on what they'd heard from the families.
We also spoke about what change would look like for the government. You can watch for our in-depth conversation. That'll be a little later on The National. First, though, to another major political story unfolding in London, and that's where Adrian is tonight.
I'm here outside Buckingham Palace tonight, where just behind me, the royal family hosted the U.S. president in lavish style, the same Donald Trump who kicked off his state visit bristling with insults. This is a country already on edge. A political hurricane just blew through here. The British Prime Minister is on her way out, and mainstream British parties just had an electoral wipeout. More on that in a moment, but suffice it to say, this is a delicate Britain at a delicate time, and Donald Trump is to many not a delicate man. While Trump received a royal welcome, not all Britons are keeping a stiff upper lip about this visit. Many are pretty vocal with their disdain. Margaret Evans takes us through the first day of Trump's tour.
Before he even set foot on British soil, the U.S. president was making his presence felt, sending out tweets from Air Force One aimed at his old foe, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. He called him a stone-cold loser, and a short one at that. Not the most statesmanlike start to what is, in fact, a state visit, with all the bells and whistles that implies, but hardly unexpected either. And who better than the Queen to deal with a potentially unpredictable guest? All the pageantry Donald Trump reportedly craves from this trip was on display. Prince Charles guided him through a guard of honor. There was a 41-gun salute, tea with Charles and Camilla, and the City of London itself, draped in the colors of the Stars and Stripes alongside the Union Jack. This visit has been touted as a chance to reinforce a frayed transatlantic alliance, the main message at tonight's glittering state banquet.
I offer a toast to the eternal friendship of our people.
Tonight we celebrate an alliance that has helped to ensure the safety and prosperity of both our peoples for decades.
But the royal buffer can only go so far, and this visit comes at one of the most difficult times in modern British history and at one of the most divided.
Donald Trump, we love you!
Many Brits are angry with their government for affording Trump an honor they don't believe he deserves, and they protested tonight.
He's divisive, he stands for everything that we stand against.
Trump has supporters here too, though, hardly comfortable with demonstrations they call insulting to an invited guest.
It's not a very British thing, it's a bit rude, and I think there's better ways for people to deal with their views on Trump than that.
But emotions are running high here, over Brexit in particular. And so far, the American president has shown no compunction about wading into that debate, no matter how painful for the country.
All right, so that was today. Let's talk about tomorrow. What kind of day is it going to be?
Well, I think most people think that if there are going to be fireworks, they're going to come tomorrow, because tomorrow is a day of political meetings. Theresa May is in the death throes of her premiership, and Donald Trump might be tempted to wade into the politics, as we've seen him do in the past. And as you've said, this country is traumatized over Brexit. The pomp and the ceremony and the pageantry we've seen today is kind of not in evidence tomorrow during the daytime. And I think that's the time when people can talk about the big issues and the areas of difference, China, Iran, climate change, all of that. And we're going to see a lot of people out on the streets protesting. And I think you're actually going to be in the midst of them tomorrow.
And we'll talk to you tomorrow night. Thanks, Mark. For a leader who likes disruption, Trump has certainly come to the right place. The two establishment political parties here were just decimated in European parliamentary elections. And national polls now put the Tories and Labour behind the newly formed Brexit Party. Those kinds of results could signal a once-in-a-generation political shift. Now, eyes are on a by-election this Thursday where the Brexit Party is trying for its first member of parliament. It's not a surprise that Nigel Farage, the Brexit evangelist, now the head of the new Brexit Party, has been getting a little American advice.
Nigel Farage.
Donald Trump is a friend. Former Trump strategist Steve Bannon a fan. Calls Farage the next tremor in a global political earthquake. They'd sure like it to be so.
They think those of us that voted Brexit are all thick, stupid, lazy, fat, ignorant racists. And that's on a good day.
I liked seeing Nigel Farage. I thought he was a good man. And he's a friend of Mr. Trump's.
The whole country staring at Peterborough now. The not-so-original Make Britain Great Again sentiment tried on for size in a place long on the forefront of change in the UK. Peterborough was among the first to throw open its arms to South Asian refugees from Uganda. Councillor Charles Swift then leading the welcome wagons.
The house is warm, the beds are made.
When we met 9 years ago, he complained immigration was excessive, migrants squatting in sheds, living in the forest.
But I know now that the place is deteriorating because it's got completely out of hand, completely out of control, and they've totally lost reality.
Now retired and determined, this lifelong Labour voter says he'll instead vote for Farage's Brexit Party.
He's a fabulous orator, but at the end of the day, he's shaking up the establishment, and they want a good kick up the backside, and that's what I hope they get.
There's no guarantee the Brexit Party or the anger behind it will win. Peterborough's economy is swelling, as is its population. Not all see crisis here. Not all want to break with Europe or a party that stands for little else. But the visiting U.S. president might recognize some of what's happening. Bombast bullying its way through political conversation.
Standing on a box shouting at people.
Oh, I see all the hair dyes probably rotted your brain, love.
Now, listen, this is not the political discourse we expect from the...
Because you're so good looking. You're obviously a model.
I'm better looking than you are.
How did politics in your country degenerate into you guys calling each other names? We don't even know each other.
To be fair, that's politics the world over.
Let's hope not, but it may be heading there.
38% of you voted for the brand new Brexit Party.
A beaming Nigel Farage wants to meet his friend Donald Trump this week. They may have a lot to discuss. It's a big week here for another reason, too. Thursday is the 75th anniversary of D-Day. So tonight, you'll hear from a Canadian who was there that day, who is sharing his story for generations to come. We'll be back with that a little bit later. Until then, back to Canada.
All right, Adrian, some people in Ottawa cleaning up today. A tornado touched down in the city's East End around dinner time last night.
I was in the kitchen, and all of a sudden I heard a crack, big crack. I said, my God, what's happening to my house?
Some homes were damaged along with trees and fences. No one was seriously hurt, but today a lot of people in the Ottawa area were wondering why they never got a tornado warning before the twister touched down. We asked the CBC's Stu Mills to find out.
A towering funnel cloud started in Ottawa's East End and raced across the valley. Once the winds finally died down again, Kim Lucier emerged from her house to see the damage. It was only after the tornado passed that she got an alert, and she thought it meant the tornado was coming back again.
It felt like, oh, look out, it's not over. That's what that message felt like. But we did not get I did not get an initial notice to take cover at all. It came out of nowhere.
Warned late and after it might have done some good, Lucier is now angry.
So it didn't work. The system's not working.
Environment Canada did issue a series of alerts for communities along the likely path of that tornado, but not for Ottawa itself. That in spite of the fact that most of the damage was done here in Ottawa. Now, there were people here who did get alerts on their phone. Those were alerts meant for people living in Gatineau. The mere fact that they were received here was due to the fact that people's cell phones were connected to cell towers based in Gatineau. For meteorologists, it underscores how hard it is to forecast the dangerous, fast-moving storms.
In some places, they got the warning several minutes before the tornado hit, but it's true that in some places they got the warning maybe a couple minutes after.
The company that sends out the alerts says it's aware there are concerns and is reviewing what happened. Lisa Ouimet watched the wind try to lift away her gazebo. Only 15 minutes after the storm had passed did they find out it had been a tornado.
That's when we got a notification. My next door neighbor got one on his phone, but it was for Gatineau. I never received anything on my phone. My son didn't receive anything. The neighbors across the street, nothing.
Ouimet is amazed that no one was hurt.
And once it was all over, I sat down and I was like, oh my goodness. I just started crying because it could have been so much worse.
Stu Mills, CBC News, Ottawa.
And people in Ottawa weren't the only ones dealing with the aftermath of severe weather today. Residents of Fort Smith in Northwest Territories are cleaning up after a powerful storm ravaged their town.
Look at this roof. Oh my God. Oh my goodness.
Strong winds and heavy rains combining to uproot trees, collapse buildings, and damage vehicles in the small northern community. Some residents reported seeing a tornado, but Environment Canada says they haven't been able to confirm that. No injuries have been reported. Thousands who fled that massive wildfire near High Level, Alberta are now returning home. The town and surrounding area have been under an evacuation order for 2 weeks. Those orders were lifted this morning. The fire still remains very much out of control, though, and officials are warning those returning to be ready to leave again on short notice.
Still ahead on The National, what's next after the inquiry? An in-depth interview with the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Plus, a Canadian veteran relives the horrors of D-Day and retraces his journey nearly 75 years later. And a little later on the show,
James Holzhauer, whose 32-day cash winnings total $2,462,216.
that winning streak coming to a dramatic end tonight. We'll show you how it all happened.
So the inquiry has finished its job. Now the work begins, devising a plan of action to break the cycle of violence against Indigenous women and girls. Carolyn Bennett is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. We sat down a few hours ago to talk about the inquiry and where we go from here. We began with that word that headlined the final report. Minister, thanks for making the time. Appreciate it.
Good to be here.
Let's start with this word that everyone has seized on today, genocide, that the inquiry felt they felt strongly they needed to use that language. Do you agree with their characterization of what happened here as genocide?
I do agree that the commissioners needed to write what they needed to write based on what they'd heard from the families, and that this was very important to families. I think for a long time we've known that the colonial policies and laws, but particularly sexism, racism, kill people, and so yeah, it's tough. But I think this is what the families need to hear.
Is that something that the Canadian government needs to recognize in some formalized way?
I think it'll be important. The main call for justice was the National Action Plan, and I think as we develop the plan, then we'll have to see what our partners want us to do.
And so what comes out of that and how you address that term will be part of that discussion. Can we talk about that discussion a little bit? Because this inquiry, I mean, frankly, I'm somewhat surprised we're here today. It got off to a very rocky start, and there were lots of sort of bumps along the way, but they managed to come up with this extensive report. Now you have to come up with a national action plan with all the same kinds of players, with all the same jurisdictions, except now the provinces have lots of different governments that maybe don't think this is as much a priority as you do. How are you going to do that? And what lessons have you learned from how you got the inquiry started?
So, I mean, you're absolutely right. And for this to be the first national public inquiry with all the provinces and territories on side, agreeing to the terms of reference, agreeing to allowing the commission into their jurisdictions, you know, that was a significant breakthrough. Now we have to work with all the partners to actually do exactly what the terms of reference said, concrete action to stop this tragedy.
There were some very, I mean, there's so many recommendations, but there were some concrete ones around the criminal code, and I just want to point to two of them, that violence against Indigenous women would be considered an aggravating factor at sentencing, and secondly, that if there's a pattern of abuse in previous relationships, that the crime would be more serious as well, first-degree murder. How important is it to recharacterize, requalify violence against Indigenous women as a deterrent?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to look at all of the, you know, the calls for justice, but also, I think that we know with the issue of abuse and where child abuse leads to drugs and alcohol, anger, shame, suicide, violence, incarceration, that there is a continuum where a lot of people want people to get help. So. As we heard throughout the pre-inquiry, hurt people, and that a lot of people also want us to really look at the causes.
But as you read through it, it is overwhelming a little bit to read, and overwhelming to think of how to solve it. Do you now, after all of this, where do you think we are at as a country on this issue?
I think we need to redouble our efforts to have the 95% of Canadians not from a Indigenous background on side. I think that blaming and shaming has been really detrimental to the progress we need to make, and that people need to read the report. They need to understand these dark chapters in our history.
So let me circle back to the first question then about genocide. Do you think that the use of that word was maybe in part to shock people a little bit? Not that it's not something that they truly believe and that they heard from families, but maybe it was to wake people up in some way.
Yeah, I don't know if that was in the intent. But I do know that certainly there today, it was very important to a lot of the people who were there. That they feel that, and they want people to understand how they felt, that their lives were less valuable. And I think, to me, we can't let these families down. We can't let them down again. And we need to be able to move forward.
Okay. Minister, thank you. Appreciate it.
We'll be back from London after the break. Part of the reason we're here in Europe this week marks 75 years since D-Day. So up next on The National, the story of a Canadian who was on the beach that day.
Recognize that guy?
Yeah.
He was handsome, wasn't he?
Well, that was taken in 1942. I was a wireless operator.
It was a long time ago.
A long while ago, yeah.
Those fields and beaches in Normandy still bear the scars of what happened there 75 years ago. The largest seaborne invasion in history. More than 150,000 Allied troops, among them 14,000 Canadians, landing on the beaches, pushing through brutal German fire. That day, D-Day, would turn the tide of the Second World War. Many of those Canadians were young, some teenagers away from home for the first time. Their trip to the battlefields of Europe usually began on a train. And while they may have left as boys, those who came home returned as men, as Tom Murphy learned when he took a traveling companion on a trip back in time.
The years may have taken their toll, but the memories, they do not fade for 98-year-old Haviland Chasson.
Canada didn't have an army in '39, so they started recruiting all over Canada. Every city and town, they were trying to recruit a battalion, like the North Shore.
That's New Brunswick's North Shore Regiment, which, like so many across the country, supplied a generation of young men to a raging battle.
What was it like to leave your parents, to leave your home?
It was okay, because we were all looking for jobs, and we were all thinking that it would last.
Were you worried? Were you scared?
No, I was scared. In action, I told one young fellow in high school here, he said, "Were you ever scared?" I said, "You're scared all the time." All the time, night and day, yeah. You had no idea that it was going to be like that. No idea. No idea at all. No. Later on in the war, of course, you realized what war was all about. But up until then, you didn't realize.
All these years later, weighed down with medals and memories, Haviland Chasson is retracing his steps, getting back on a train to Halifax to take us on a trip back in time.
We're gonna get you on the train, Haviland. I want to show you something.
Oh, yeah.
Recognize that guy?
Yeah.
He was handsome, wasn't he?
Well, that was taken in 1942. I was a wireless operator.
It's a long time ago.
A long while ago, yeah.
When you were going to Halifax on the train, did you really understand what you were getting into?
No. We knew we were going to England, but as I mentioned before, we didn't think it would last. But little did we realize it was going to last almost 5 years. Well, there were so many ships in between Halifax and Bedford Basin, they said you could walk right across the ship. They were side by side all the way.
In fact, it was a massive convoy across the Atlantic. Troop ships loaded down with soldiers headed for England, where Haviland and so many others trained for the D-Day invasion.
We knew the Blitz was on in London, we knew that. So that was quite a lot to think about all the time.
A lot on your mind.
Yeah.
What was D-Day like for you?
Well, we had trained for 5 years for D-Day. We were all landing at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. There was about 3,000 to 4,000 landing crafts all in the water at the same time. Some of them hit mines and were blown up. Others hit reefs, got stuck there. Some of them got a quarter mile offshore, and there were a lot of them were drowned. And we were lucky. Several of our crafts, including ours, hit right on the beach. It's only about a foot of water. So that's what D-Day was like. Yeah.
And what did you see? What did you hear?
Well, the first thing, of course, that happened, we lost 100 men in our regiment, killed or wounded. So that was the biggest shock of all. We knew something was going to happen, but we had no idea that many men would be killed or wounded. And then, of course, the next day it didn't make any difference. You just knew that somebody was killed, or Bill was killed, Jim was killed. You didn't pay much attention. It was just a common thing.
You had to keep on going.
You had to keep on going. That's the way it happened. That happened quite a bit, you know.
You lost a lot of good friends.
Yeah, just that way, yeah.
Tell me about your favorite message that you had to send out.
Well, that was May the 3rd. The war ended on our front on May the 3rd. And the official ending was May the 8th. And the colonel jumped in my slit trench, and he had message like that. Send this message out. So I looked at it, it said, ceasefire, don't fire unless you're fired on by the enemy.
How did you feel that day?
Oh, yeah. That was a good feeling.
You were glad it was over?
Yeah, you were happy it was over. Yeah.
Haviland is one of the last surviving members of his battalion. His duty now, he feels, is to tell his story.
A lot of people don't want to tell their stories. I think that's wrong. I think they should. When I go back over there and go in these cemeteries and read a lot of the names of people that I knew, a lot of them, and I say to myself, was it really necessary? Why couldn't people just be able to talk some sense into one another? But then I say to myself, well, the thing is going on the same way today. They're still fighting in all these countries, and they got more knowledge than those people back in those days. I don't know why. I don't know. It's a mystery.
What did you learn about yourself in the war?
Well, you learned, I think, one thing. You went in as a boy and you come out as a man.
So we're getting close to Halifax. Haviland, I just want to thank you for getting on that train more than 75 years ago and doing what you did.
Yeah, I know. It was quite a thing.
We had quite a trip happen.
I saw some gadgets today I haven't seen before.
Tom Murphy, CBC News, Halifax.
We have a lot more coverage planned for you this week. Wednesday night, we will be in Normandy with the story of the Canadian women who had a critical but different wartime mission to decode and listen. If people can be national treasures, then 96-year-old Elsa Lassard is one of Canada's. Voila! Shouting from the rooftops now about what she did during the Second World War and was ordered to keep quiet about for decades. Elsa was a listener.
The listeners around the world shortened the war by 2 years at least and saved 250,000 lives. So that makes me feel pretty important and in good company.
Work so crucial for D-Day, for ending the war.
Mrs. Elsa Lassard.
Recognition has been a long time coming. Elsa and the listeners this week on The National. And on Thursday, the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Join us for a CBC News special starting at 5 a.m. Eastern. You can watch it on CBC Television, CBC News Network, and stream it live on cbcnews.ca and on GEM.
Up next on The National, a Moncton couple's desperate search for answers in the death of their baby. Why years later they're still left wondering whether the hospital could have done more.
At first I was like, well, where is she? And I didn't believe anyone when they told me that she didn't make it.
Jessica Leclerc and Andrew Randall's daughter was born without a heartbeat, gone before the young couple could speak to her. Now they want answers. As Gabrielle Fami explains, the hospital that delivered their baby, along with the province's health system, is struggling with staff shortages.
An ultrasound showing a healthy baby girl stuck to the fridge is a daily reminder for Jessica Leclerc and Andrew Randall of the daughter they lost.
At first I was like, well, where is she? And I didn't believe anyone when they told me that she didn't make it.
Leclerc was put on oxytocin to induce labor. Because the drug causes strong contractions, the baby's heart rate has to be monitored closely.
So they monitored for like 30 minutes, and then boom, they stopped. Nothing.
In the medical file, there are gaps for parts of the night where the baby's heart rate is supposed to be recorded, and a note that says she should be taken off the drug because there wasn't enough staff to monitor her.
As the night proceeded, I noticed the heart was going down, and I could hear the bell going off. And I said, "Is that normal?"
By morning, Leclerc was bleeding. Rushed to the operating room, baby Mackenzie was born without a heartbeat. The couple's met with hospital officials many times, but they still question what happened. Horizon Health says it can't discuss cases. It says it has contingency plans in place to ensure patients get proper care, but admits, like in many other hospitals in the province, the labor and delivery unit does struggle with understaffing. New Brunswick is grappling with a critical nursing shortage, with nearly 400 nursing positions vacant. It's especially bad on maternity wards, which in some places have had to shut down services, in one case for months. The autopsy says baby Mackenzie died from lack of oxygen. For her parents, that's not good enough.
I firmly believe that the C-section should have been done at least like a couple of hours earlier.
They're now considering their legal options. Gabrielle Famy, CBC News, Moncton.
Next on The National, for more than 40 years, no one was able to crack the mystery in a small Alberta town until now.
I was just total disbelief. Kids were excited, and a little bit of dust fell to the floor, and I'm like, oh my goodness.
What this Fort McMurray father discovered next in our moment. But first, in case you missed it, for weeks, Jeopardy fans have been asking, when will James Holzhauer shatter the all-time winnings record?
So we could see a new record set here today. But
Alex, falling short for 1,000. When is never? Yep, the 34-year-old's winning streak came to an end in tonight's episode. It all came down to Final Jeopardy.
the line, "A great reckoning in a little room," in As You Like It, is usually taken to refer to this author's premature death.
He didn't even get it wrong.
Over to James now. He had 23,400, and his response was correct.
But he must have known that wouldn't be enough. Even if he bet everything, he'd still fall short of the leader if she got it right. And she did.
What a game. Oh, my God.
Holzhauer was a Jeopardy phenomenon, chasing the record held by the legend Ken Jennings. Holzhauer took home more than $2 million in just 27 games. Jennings' record, $2.5 million, but it took him 74 games. In an interview with the New York Times, Holzhauer said, "Nobody likes to lose," but he admitted he exceeded even his own expectations. For almost 30 years, a safe has sat unopened in the Vermilion Heritage Museum in Alberta. Lots of visitors and employees have tried to open it, but for the longest time, no one succeeded. Until now. Stephen Miles was visiting with his family when their tour guide gave the usual spiel about how the safe was unopenable. As a joke, Mills got down, pressed his ear to the safe, fiddled with the combination, and what happened next is our moment.
He got down on his knees, and inside of about 2 minutes, the safe was open.
And cracked it open. And I was just total disbelief. It was quite amazing, and Tom was equally surprised. The whole family was. It was great. Kids got excited. They're like, "We beat it. We beat the code." Surprised
Everybody in the room, particularly myself, because I've seen so many people try it, and nothing works.
It wasn't a pile of gold. We were all excited because I was kind of nervous, really, when you opened the door because you didn't know what to expect.
There's a pay slip for a hotel employee, a waitress's order pad.
We were all curious to see what was inside. Even though it was just a few little odds and ends, it was still a once-in-a-lifetime thing for sure.
Amazing, right? So actually the safe had not been opened since 1978, so just a little younger than my current age. Just always like to get that in there. And the combo that Stephen put in, not a magical combo, 20, 40, 60. Seems like anyone could have figured that out, but I guess he did.
That is the 1960s safe equivalent of password as your password. 20, 40, 60 as the combination. Although he points out he's not entirely sure if that was actually the combination that unlocked it, or maybe this old safe just kind of gave up and all you had to do is pretend you're fiddling with it and open it. Either way, I love this story. I love old safes. Yes. I can't wait to go to a museum and try 20, 40, 60. That is The National for June 3rd. Good night.